All right, what is good? Deepak Chona, Sports Med Analytics, bringing you some NFL injury updates today. Thank you very much for joining. Now let's get it popping. Now we start with Marquise Hollywood Brown. The news came out from Andy Reid that he will sit week 1. That's really not a setback. We really planned for that the whole time, if you will. They had given us a week 1 to week 3 range for him. And prior data, meaning Tyreek Hill a few years back and Danny Amendola before him, same position with the same injury, both missed a full 4 weeks and then returned on the 5th. For Marquise, that would be week 2 as a realistic target return date. Now, the data on both of those previous cases supports him playing at a pretty high level upon return. And mechanically, that makes a lot of sense to us as well, because this SC joint right in the middle of the chest area isn't one that you would expect to cause a lot of weakness or any major changes in the way that Hollywood Brown moves his arm. So we would expect him to come back at a strong level, probably week 2, but likely not later than week 3. There should be a relatively low re-injury risk with this because it's a relatively rare injury to begin with. And then we have Tyreek Hill. Now, the comments have suggested that he's dealing with a very mild severity thumb injury. Obviously, a thumb injury for a wide receiver could be a big deal because it can affect grip strength. The fact that he's been doing drills on the side does somewhat softly suggest this is a mild injury, but the comments in general in the offseason and in training camp tend to always downplay injuries, so we can't really take a whole lot just from that. The early week practice status coming up will really confirm or refute the severity of this. Then we have Jonathan Brooks. He's placed on the PUP, and that's not a setback. And that's really important to remember because if you look here, the data on Jonathan Brooks, when he comes back, it does predict him to come back week 5. There is going to be likely a 4-week ramp-up period, which is the average for young running backs, and that's to get their touches up to baseline. But if you look at Jonathan Brooks' ceiling, it is truly league-winning upside in the sense that his profile is quite similar to Breece Hall from last year. And Hall last year had 130 yards per game, 1 touchdown per game his last 5 weeks of the season. So Brooks, when he first comes back, likely week 5, projects to be at about 85% of his per touch efficiency for production. And then as he ramps up his touches, you're looking at about week 9 or so when he should be at near full strength from a snap count and workload perspective. And then at that point is also the time point when he is projecting to hit about 90% of his per touch efficiency. So the last few weeks of the year, and particularly your fantasy playoffs, that could be a real boost to your team. And then we have Jahmyr Gibbs. Now, preseason hamstrings do increase our in-season injury risk. Jahmyr Gibbs also has had a prior significant hamstring injury. So all of that taken together, there's about a 20% re-injury risk compared to other running backs the first 8 weeks of this season. However, we do expect a strong start to the season here. The data projects him to be at 90 or more percent of his per touch efficiency week 1. The one thing to keep in mind, and especially more for the DFS players, is that when players come back from hamstring injuries because of that re-injury risk, we do tend to see a mild dip in their touches, particularly when their backup is strong. And David Montgomery is about as good as a second running back as there is. So we do expect a little bit extra work for David Montgomery and a little less for Jahmyr Gibbs in those first couple weeks. Next up is Puka Nacua. Now, this one is interesting in the sense that it's not every day that we hear such clarity from a coach on what the injury diagnosis is. Sean McVay came out saying this is a bursa injury, a burst bursa injury, and these can swell up. They can be annoying, sometimes painful, but they're not structurally unstable, so it can safely be played through even if it flares up in season. Now, given that he's had several weeks now and he's already returned to practice, Puka Nacua is likely going to be 100% at week 1. We don't really think this should downgrade him in any way. And furthermore, when we look at Sean McVay's coach speak index rating on injury accuracy, it's 90%. That is about as high as I've seen from that very good service. So we would expect us to be able to trust that Puka Nacua will be on the field and playing very well, low re-injury risk for the season. Next is Christian McCaffrey, also likely playing week 1 at 100%. The issue with these calf injuries, and his was reportedly mild and they gave him plenty of time to rest, but we saw this with Joe Burrow last year, that these can get re-aggravated in season because you're always pushing off of the toes and using that calf muscle pretty forcefully, especially for a running back. So there is a mildly elevated re-injury risk in season compared to the other elite running backs, Breece Hall, Bijan Robinson. So if you're looking for a tiebreaker, that might be it at the top of your draft, but otherwise Christian McCaffrey is likely in line for a very strong season. And then we have Deshaun Watson. Of course, pretty strange of a injury situation and pretty strange guy, honestly. We have reported arm soreness last week, but if you look at the reports, it came out that he was going to play the preseason game, and then it came out that he didn't want to play the preseason game. We're suspecting that this arm soreness label was maybe a way of avoiding controversy when he wanted to sit out the preseason. And furthermore, that is kind of strengthened by the fact that his offensive line is pretty beat up, and they probably didn't want to put him out there for no reason. Now, the data on these types of injuries, and he had a fracture in his shoulder socket that was treated with surgery last year, the data favors him being 100% by week 1, and also for football players, relatively low re-injury risk when these fractures are fixed. So I do expect Deshaun Watson to be at 100%. Whatever that looks like, that's really kind of the main wild card here. But there's a low re-injury risk, and if you're looking for a healthy Deshaun, you're probably going to see it week 1. Then Joe Burrow. Now, this one is interesting in the sense that his injury history is super long. He's had wrist surgery. He's had knee surgery for an ACL, MCL tear. He had a pretty significant calf strain at the beginning of last year and last training camp. And before that, he had a finger injury that caused him to have surgery as well. So it's a long injury history, but if you look at it, there's no anatomic pattern or weak link that tells me this is an injury-prone player. And furthermore, if you look at the data following his wrist ligament surgery that he just had, that projects a pretty strong 2024 for him. Now, there's been a lot of reports about data on this type of surgery not being favorable for quarterbacks, but a lot of the data that's published out there is not in the setting of acute repair and not in the setting of the modern implants, meaning the internal brace. Joe Burrow had surgery right after the injury occurred, and they have the strongest implants in today's generation. So you have to think that these two factors together probably predict a strong return with his grip strength and with his throwing function. So I don't necessarily expect any dip here. Joe Burrow is around a plus 300 on DraftKings Sportsbook for the Comeback Player of the Year award, and pretty good value if you ask me. And then Justin Herbert. Now, dealing with a plantar fascia injury, the downside to this is that the plantar fascia is the type of thing that can flare up in season. I would say it's a relatively low chance because if you look at the severity of his injury, we kind of know for sure that it's relatively mild in the sense that he missed 2 to 3 weeks in a boot of training camp, but he came back unrestricted well before the game started, about 2.5 weeks before games actually start. So that timeline in the way they manage training camp injuries confirms that this is relatively mild. We do expect him to start the season with strong mobility. And Justin Herbert, even if this does flare up, it can be managed in season with things like injection or putting him in a boot to rest it for the midweek portion. So with his durability history of playing through tons of injuries, relatively low chance it even causes missed games here. Then we have Josh Downs. Now, he's progressing. He's out of the boot. He's walking relatively normally is what we hear from reports. That's a big difference from cutting off of a high ankle. So data suggests that week 1 is a possibility, but that week 2 or 3 is much more likely. When Josh Downs returns, the reason you don't really push these guys back is because when they return, there is somewhat of a re-injury risk, and the faster you come back, the higher that re-injury rate is. So if he returns week 1, we're looking for an efficiency dip about 15% is what our data projects, but more importantly, a re-injury risk up to about 20 to 25%. Week 2 to 3, that re-injury risk is a little bit lower, but until about week 6 is when we expect to see that go to its baseline level for wide receivers. Next is TJ Hockenson, also on the pup. Not really a surprise here. Pretty big injury, 2 ligaments in the knee, and pretty late in the season. So we wouldn't really expect a week 5 return here, even though that's when he becomes eligible. The data on TJ Hockenson predicts more likely a mid-October to early November return date. Now, he's young. He's about 26 years old at the time of injury. He has relatively high athletic metrics, 80th percentile for his position. So sometimes players can push that up, especially with those 2 predictive factors. But when he does come back, the data does favor about a 15% efficiency dip initially. We also seem to think he's going to be getting a ramp up, and that comes from some of the comments that have been made so far. Now, the last third of the season, the last 6 or so games, that's when he projects to hit his 90% level. And if he's activated in even early November, we would expect that ramp up to have occurred by the end of November. So those last few games in your fantasy playoffs, TJ Hockenson could be a big boost. Next is Jaylen Warren. Now, very likely playing week 1, but off of a hamstring injury, these can recur. There's about a 15% re-injury risk. The data is very similar to Jahmyr Gibbs, suggests about a 90% efficiency compared to his baseline, but with importantly decreased touches compared to normal. And that's also important because he has Najee Harris as his backfield running mate. So you would expect Najee to get a little bit extra work here. Next is Nick Chubb, also on the pup, also not really a surprise or a setback. A week 5 return here would be very surprising to me. Now, 2 multi-ligament knee injuries on a single knee is essentially unprecedented territory, which is where Nick Chubb is coming back from. There are major dips projected, and that we'd say is 25% or more that is projected in terms of his per touch efficiency when he does come back initially. Furthermore, you're likely to see a long ramp up. The average is about 4 games, but I wouldn't be surprised to see that be much higher, or even them keep a Jerome Ford, Nick Chubb split the entire way this regular season. And the reason for that is that re-injury on this knee could totally end his career. So we would expect a slow return, give him plenty of time to regain his strength, regain his agility. Reportedly, he has, of course, we've seen the video of him squatting a ton of weight, which is great and impressive in its own way, but it's very different than 1, making cuts, and 2, getting hit. So we think there's some way to go with Nick Chubb. Again, a lot of risk here, so would expect them to go slow. Then Packers, Christian Watson. So it's a little unclear what his role will be just because they have such a deep wide receiver core, but I really like the way things are shaping up for him in terms of his future injury risk compared to before. Now, they talked about Christian Watson having during last season a 20% hamstring strength asymmetry, and that's pretty massive. And the reason is that asymmetry between the 2 legs is a major risk factor for injury. When I test my patients for return to sports, we look at side-to-side strength of every muscle group. And Watson's is reportedly less than 10% now. And that's a key threshold because it drastically lowers your injury risk when you hit that 90% point. So with Christian Watson, there's no guarantees here, but we would say compared to the normal player who has a ton of hamstring injuries, Christian Watson's his risk is probably lower than that. Then his teammate MarShawn Lloyd, another hamstring. He's not practicing yet. The data does slightly favor him playing week 1, and he did avoid the PUP or the NFI or IR. But the early week practice reports here are going to be key. And there's a high re-injury risk here the first 8 weeks because you have to remember MarShawn Lloyd is not just dealing with a hamstring, but this is actually already a re-aggravated hamstring from earlier this offseason. Then James Bradberry on the Eagles. They said tendon injury, non-operative treatment, 6 to 8 weeks. Not a clear diagnosis, but the thing to keep in mind is that you would expect some performance dip when he returns, just because he's going to have some pretty significant activity limitations when he has this tendon injury. Presumably, with that length of time, he's going to be in a boot for some of it and not going to be fully weight-bearing, or at least probably limiting how much he's going to do on that. And as a result, you're going to get some atrophy, some disuse of the muscles. And that's going to be the real concern when he does come back. Then the Bills' Matt Milano, limited data here on same season return for biceps repair. He is probably, I would think, 4 to 5 months, which would put him December to January. He had surgery in August. And the reason for that is that most of us start our biceps repair patients on real significant strengthening at about 3 months post-op. And it usually takes a little bit of time, at least a few weeks, to really ramp up that strengthening once it starts. So with Matt Milano, would think that you can get him back probably for the playoffs in the last maybe third of the season. And then Talanoa Hufanga of the 49ers, post ACL, the playing week 1 is possible, but feels pretty ambitious. The other part of this is that DBs do tend to see a pretty significant production dip their first year back. He is cleared from the standpoint of he can participate in practice now. But again, we do expect to see a little bit of a ramp up. My guess is probably sometime week 2 or week 3 is when you see Hufanga starting to get back. And that's all I got for today. So let us know who you got for questions. Hit us up on Twitter, Instagram, or right here in the comments section. And as always, you can search sportsmananalytics.com for all of our updates. Thank you for joining.